So let's go to the adult eczema, and I'm going to give you the story of my son-in-law, Matthew. Matthew married my daughter when I think they were both about 21, 22, and he had a little bit of eczema. And he told me the story that when he was a little boy, he had very bad eczema. He said he can remember his legs bleeding, he used to scratch so much. And he can remember his parents fighting. The mother didn't want him to have the cortisone cream, but the father did to bring him some relief. And he said, if Dad won, I got the cream and got a bit of relief. But he said it always came back. And so now he's 22, and it's a little bit under control because he discovered if he keeps away from dairy and he only has a little bit of wheat, it's kept under control. There was a little bit in the corner of his arms and a little bit in his hair, but he said it was much managed. And then he moved to Queensland to do a course. And while he was doing the course, he was doing a massage course, he stayed in an old house. Now this house was about to be demolished. So he's 22, I think, at the time. He and another 2 young guys got the house cheap, $10 a week rent, something like that. So for young guys who don't have a lot of money, that was very attractive. So they went into this old house, and unbeknownst to them, there was a lot of mold in the house. There was a lot of big trees over the house, and of course the young guys didn't even think of that. And they were out working all day, so they were just really sleeping there. And Matthew got boxes of bananas cheap. So he was eating, probably half of his diet was just bananas. He said it was just real easy. He'd get bananas and bread for lunch and bananas and cereal for breakfast, and he'd just cook up a heap of veggies at night and have bananas for dessert. They were very proud of themselves that they had this cheap food. But if you know bananas, it's very high in sweet. And he's getting exposure to the mold, and he didn't even realize it because he was sound asleep. If he'd been awake in the room, he would have noticed that it's a stuffy room, but he just kept the windows wide open. So his eczema flared up, and it flared up very, very badly, worse than it, even since he was a child. So he just sort of bore with it. And then he moved back down to Victoria where we were. It's a cooler climate, which is nicer on eczema because the heat can really intensify it. And he went on a fairly strict diet. He eliminated all dairy, he eliminated all refined sugar. He even went on a low fruit diet, and it just got back under control, back under control. He found that he could eat some oats, but not the wheat. And then let's fast forward, things were fairly good for another 10, 15 years, and they moved down to Tasmania. And he loved Tasmania because it's cold down in Tasmania. And in the cold weather, the eczema was not as bad. And they had a couple of children, and he was now an architect. And he was doing some work. But when you're a tradesman, you don't get paid until the work is done, and sometimes people don't pay, and so there was a bit of stress in his life. He's got a rented house with his wife and little ones, so whenever stress would happen, his eczema would get very, very bad. And they were living in student accommodation, which was an old house, so a couple of factors coming together there, and it got really bad again. Now about this time, they read the book by Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride called Gut and Psychology, and they looked at the role that the gut played in diseases in the body, and they decided to do a vegetarian version of her diet, which is just soup. So what Matthew did, he eliminated all grain, and right in the middle of all this, he came up and worked for us on our property for a couple of weeks, so I knew exactly what he was eating. So he would have this big pot of soup, and he'd put beetroot, and he'd put carrots, and he'd put pumpkins and sweet potatoes and lots of celeries and greens. He also kept away from the nightshade group of vegetable, which is bell pepper, tomato, eggplant and white potato. So that was what was in his soup. And he ate 2 bowls in the morning, 2 bowls at lunch and 2 bowls at night. Now he was also eating with us, so we'd have the legumes that we have, and he'd have some salad, And at lunchtime he'd have some of the cooked vegetables we were having and some of the legumes, and he always walked out the door with a handful of macadamia nuts and a carrot. That was his dessert. And his eczema totally cleaned up. He said for the first time in his life it totally cleared up, but it took a couple of months to do that since those other foods were out of his body. He always had a long blonde ponytail. Well, he's cut his hair short, and that helped to clear up the eczema in his scalp. His story is quite remarkable because it shows how changing different foods helped him to manage it. But what he also had to do, he also had to go on an antifungal diet. So he had to get his sugars right down. Now, when he was living with me, he did not eat any grain and he did not eat any fruit. Now, it's probably 10 years later today now, and Matthew eats fruit, and Matthew eats a little wheat, and Matthew eats some oats. But can you see that while he was conquering it, he totally eliminated that? So a lot of people have found that just eliminating the wheat and the oats and the peanuts and the dairy and the refined sugar, that is enough.